Hello, everyone. I am Mirsad Kriještorac, and I'm joining you from South Florida. I am senior researcher at Bratislava-based Minority Issues Research Institute, known by its MIRI acronym. Our MIRI is dedicated on working towards promoting and protecting human and minority rights in Slovakia and abroad. We believe in the importance of research, education, and active involvement in shaping a more just society. As a part of our activities, we hold monthly conversations with experts and people around the world about important international affairs and issues significantly affecting societies and minorities as our effort to educate and empower general public. To repeat the usual code of conduct for our events, we are going to first hear the presentation by our guests for about 20 minutes or so, 20 to half an hour, and after that we will open a discussion for questions and answers. At that point, if you want to ask a question in person, please indicate in the chat and we will call upon you. Once your microphone is on, please introduce yourself, tell us where you are joining us from, and then ask your question. You're also welcome to type in your questions in the chat box, and we will try to ask them on your behalf. Today, we are to mark and remember the World Human Rights Day, along with the United Nations as the main institution that supports them. Ever since they were established in 1945, the United Nations have served as the custodian of commonly agreed norms and standards, and as such, it was created essentially to be a platform for interstate cooperation. Thus far, such cooperation has been primarily oriented and open just for the states and their institutions. Yet, there are many people and nations that live within the states they do not control nor want, and such exclusive international orientation towards states often causes neglect and endangering of such populations who might be minorities or simply people who are not seen as full or equal part of the populations. Perhaps such situation is the result of the United Nations prime focus to provide peace and security only, because interstate conflicts are seen as the most dangerous type of conflicts due to the state's ability to openly possess and use weapons of mass destruction in conflicts against other states. However, lately we are witnessing how such large-scale violence is now carried by states against stateless people, whether in Palestine, in China, in Myanmar, Syria, Russia, Sudan, Israel, and elsewhere. And we are also witnessing the United Nations inability to act effectively and prevent mass atrocities in such cases. As a result, global human rights norms, along with the United Nations, are being undermined and questioned by both aggressors and victims. It appears that we now live in what many call world of disorder. It appears also that the rule-based order that arose after the end of the World War II, along with the United Nations, is now declining. Instead of multilateral cooperation, multipolar competition and raw power dominates politics and international relations. Along with such competition, many of the norms, principles, rules, and institutions built over the last 8 decades are under threat, as they also became pawn in the global competition. Since our MIRI considers United Nations as one of the most important institutions built by the world to support cooperation among people and states and uphold rules and values such as universal human rights, we invited Sir Charles Petrie to converse about the current state of the United Nations as the pillar of the global human rights structure, as well as what new horizons and challenges that both the United Nations and human rights regime are now facing. Sir Charles Petrie has close to 30-year experience working in a context of conflict and famine, much of it within the United Nations system, where he has assumed senior-level operational and policy responsibilities in Afghanistan, Burundi, Democratic Republic of Congo, Gaza, and the Palestinian territories, Myanmar, Burma, Republic of Congo, Rwanda, even during the 1994 genocide in Rwanda, Somalia, South Africa, and Sudan. Sir Petrie resigned from the United Nations at the end of 2010 as the Secretary General's representative to Burundi. In March of 2012, Sir Petrie was designated by the United Nations Secretary General to lead an internal review of the United Nations action in Sri Lanka during the last phase of the conflict, which subsequently led to the Secretary General right up front policy. In the first half of 2015, Charles Petrie was designated as a member of a group of experts commissioned by the United Nations Secretary General to review the UN peacebuilding approach architecture. In 2021, he published a book, The Triumph of Evil, the Rwanda Genocide and Search for Justice. Last year, Charles Petrie has been awarded Sir Brian Urquhart Award for his distinguished service to the United Nations. Now, Sir Petrie, you please take over.
Thank you. I appreciate your introduction and definitely understand the focus on the UN and the UN's the role the UN plays in protecting or promoting the rights of individuals. I think I'll start off with something a little bit broader because I think we've entered a world, well, actually that you've also mentioned. We've entered a world that does not necessarily adhere to the rules and the rules that were established after the Second World War. I think in terms of the UN, and sort of picking up what you said, in terms of the UN, basically you could say that the UN has three components to it. The first component is the role of the convener. I mean, it's a body, it's an international body that allows nation states to come together to discuss difficulties, to resolve differences. And the let's say the two key organs of that convening role are the Security Council and the General Assembly, which I'm sure we'll discuss a bit more later. The second, also, as you mentioned, is the UN is the forum in which norms, standards, principles, and laws are agreed. In a way, it's the body that sets out the rules of the game, the rules of international interaction. And it goes from, postal services, regulating aviation, all the way to protection and human rights. The third, let's say, dimension dimension of the UN is it's a service provider through UN agencies in many different sectors. I think what's really important to understand about the UN is the UN in itself is not an enforcement body. Basically, as I said before, basically the UN is the body where there's an agreed set of rules that are reached or that the international community agrees to abide by. But it's only the way that the UN functions is through political will. The UN, without the political will of member states, the UN cannot enforce the rules that have been agreed to through the different mechanisms in place. I think there is in terms of within the UN as an entity, there is a natural tension that exists in defining what is the UN. There's almost a realpolitik approach within the UN, which is the UN is sort of the emanation of the will of member states, that it's nothing more than translating the will of member states into international interactions, international action. The other view, of which when I was in the UN, I was much more sort of comfortable with, is that the UN is actually the promoter of the UN Charter. That the UN is there to guarantee and promote the components of the UN Charter, which I'll come to a little bit later. I think what's very clear is that the UN and multilateralism today is under strain and under serious threat. I mean, the UN as a convener has lost its ability to actually take collective action or to push collective action. And that we see with the paralysis of the Security Council. Of course, we've seen it quite evidently over the last few years or recent years, but I would say that the Security Council as a functioning body, the last time the Security Council functioned as a functioning body was around Libya, and the consensus that populations had to be protected, populations had to be saved, and there was a Security Council resolution that was unanimous in the support of the members. Unfortunately, the regime change that occurred in Libya broke that consensus, and ever since, I think, ever since it has been impossible. Not only has it been impossible to find consensus around action, but there's so much distrust that it's actually entrenched the paralysis that the Security Council faces. So that's on the UN as a convener. The UN as a forum for international rules and standards. There are multiple, well, or as the definer and the definer of the rules of the game and the acceptance of the rules of the game. I think there are a number of factors that lead to the fact that this is no longer, that it's been severely eroded. Yeah. The first is that the UN sort of real growth came after the Cold War. During the Cold War, the UN really played the role as a platform where issues could be brought up and to a certain extent, tensions and conflicts could be addressed or conflicts could be reduced. After the collapse or after the end of the Cold War, we found ourselves in a unipolar world, and this unipolar world, Western-led, produced sort of new rules in terms of protection, rights up front. The responsibility to protect, so more on the human rights protection side, also new forms of collaboration. But after, so that was the 90s, the beginning of the 2000s. Slowly, what we saw was the emergence of a multipolar world for many different reasons, many different dynamics. And in the emergence of this multipolar world, the thrust or the direction that was taken after the Cold War became increasingly seen as a Western agenda and the imposition of a Western agenda. So I think the acceptance of the rules of the game today are partly undermined by the belief by other parts of the world that these are rules of the game that were established when, during the period of a unipolar world where Western values were being pushed. The second, the compounding, I think, that sense of a world that has to be more understanding of other realities and other beliefs and ideologies is the sense of double standards of hypocrisy that has emerged when comparing the UN and the West's approach to Ukraine with that of Gaza. Finally, in terms of accepting the rules of the UN as as a forum where agreed rules of the game are implemented and respected, is the fact that we've seen over the last few years that flouting the rules that flouting the rules has no repercussions, and that many countries or a number of countries now are actually just completely ignoring the decisions or the rules themselves as they're. The service delivery side, of course, is also under tremendous strain, and that's one because of the clear reduction in international aid. Of course, the U.S.'s government's closure of USAID has had a huge impact on aid, but then so has Europe's war footing. I think Europe has entered a new era of dealing with threat, with military threat. And you have this 5% of GDP that is a commitment, and that 5% has to come from somewhere, and we're seeing an increasing reduction in aid. What I think further contributes to that is the whole immigration issue and how that has entered Western politics, and the extent to which now many politicians and even parliaments are less generous in their approach towards the needs of countries outside. I think, and that's sort of almost the starting point. I think we need to understand, we must never forget that the UN comes out of the ashes of two world wars, and what the UN was created by a series of I would call enlightened leaders who, through the experience of two world wars, realized that the forcible application of national interests on the world stage did not guarantee long-term stability. There was this understanding, which actually even started after the First World War with the creation of the League of Nations, but again after the Second World War, that you needed to have a platform. You needed to have a platform where misunderstandings could be addressed, where there could be a collective effort to try and resolve specific tensions and to avoid conflict. Where you needed a platform where debate and discussion was undertaken in a manner that allowed the voice of smaller nations to be heard. That is, in a way, the raison d'être of the UN as encapsulated by the UN Charter. I think there is the case to be made that we have reverted to a world that existed in the 1930s. We've entered an almost Darwinian form of world order where the strong or those with power try to impose their will. We're seeing emerge zones of influence in different parts, competing zones of influence. We're also seeing in this context a UN that has been severely weakened. It's a UN that has been weakened, of course, because of the loss of importance given to multilateralism, by international actors not turning to the UN to try and address difficulties, the instrumentalization of the UN at times in certain actions. But we've also seen a UN that has grown significantly, and now with the budget and very much on the service providing sense that has grown dramatically. But now with the budget cuts, I mean the funding cuts that are draconian, rather than try and see, rather than have a strategic review of what is the added value of the UN in terms of service delivery, there's a focus much more on how to do the same with less, and not necessarily a realization of how existential these budget cuts are for the UN today. So we're seeing a UN that is not necessarily equipping itself for the challenges that are in front of us. But I mean, I say that we are back in that we are in an international environment that resembles what existed in the 30s, but there are certain fundamental differences between now and then. The first fundamental difference is we do have now with the UN, we have rules, we have standards, we have norms. I mean, we have mechanisms that exist to facilitate and support international cooperation and multilateralism. So compared, and again, one could look at 30 years ago, but then I would say, let's look back 200 or 150 years ago and realize how much society and how much the world has evolved from 150 and 200 years ago. There are instruments, mechanisms, agreements in place that can be used. And again, we come back to it's political will that actually gives substance substance to this structure that is the UN, that gives life, actually more than substance, that gives life to what is the UN, what is multilateralism. The other thing that has fundamentally changed since the 30s is we have a much more informed world population, through social media, through education. And that has translated to some extent to the emergence of a new form of activists, a new generation of activists, a generation of activists who have more in common with each other throughout the world than they actually have with their parents, which means we have a new generation of activists who mobilize around issues and their concerns around issues. And that is a motor that I think is a significant change, and to a certain extent, I feel brings hope. And then of course, when we talk about the UN, we definitely focus a lot more on the sort of the human rights protection, conflict reduction, peacekeeping. But there are a number of structures of the UN that remain functioning. As I mentioned, there are a lot of technical ones, postal, aviation, all of the telecommunications. There are a whole series of bodies that continue to function. But and I'll stop here. So we have the UN, which is sort of emerged from the Second World War, emerged from a realization that the forceful push of national interests on an international body does not necessarily guarantee long-term peace. So we have these new rules of the game that exist. We have a new generation of activists, but but we are in a situation where the UN right now is almost lifeless because there isn't that strong political will to get it to function. How can we come back there? I think one is the hope that there will be a number of enlightened leaders who will emerge, who will understand that interconnectivity, international relations, working together will actually favor, if not guarantee, long-term stability and peace. I think there is that hope that there will be the emergence of a realization of how much we actually do need to work together. And again, I think what's interesting about this Generation Z activism is that they are cross borders, cross national. They do interact. So there is that web that exists that hopefully politicians will start listening to. The other way where we could see multilateralism regain its significance or a multilateral world emerge is a cataclysmic event, an epidemic, but an even more serious epidemic than the COVID, which was already extremely serious, that will force nations and governments to understand that they do need to work together, that they do need to find common approaches and to share approaches. And then, of course, the third let's say the third. I mean, the third one is war. That we will enter a war again, and we will emerge from that war with an understanding that ultimately nobody will really be a winner, and that we need to work together. So I was asked to talk about the United Nations. Again, I think the world as it is today does not allow the United Nations really to have the impact it should. And then I was asked to talk about human rights, and again, human rights. Human rights are define the standards of how we should work, the standards of protecting minorities, protecting populations, the rights of individuals. But again, if there isn't the political will to defend and apply it, then it exists, and I think it has to exist, if nothing more than to document what is happening for hopefully a future time when action can be taken and some form of restitutive process can be undertaken. But right now, I think it's well, again, I think the UN and these human rights mechanisms are not enforcers in themselves. They are the agreed way they are the way we had once agreed we should work, and they will continue to exist. And one has to hope that we will come back to that understanding that this is the best way to work.
Well, thank you. It's not very optimistic, saying that we are in 1930s sounds very scary, right? I mean, we already have some questions that are kind of good to pose, but I just want to ask, since you mentioned, right? You mentioned many different issues, like, for example, real politics. Can real politics work with institutions such as United Nations, which are more aspirational than based on reality? We understand who we are as creatures, but we would like to kind of go beyond what we are, right? Whatever we assume that we are, right? And so that real politics doesn't work. And I remember when I spoke to several, United Europe, I mean, EU, right? European Union, how you say, officials, they keep saying how many of the leaders who were born either around the World War II still remember the things, and they're getting scared by new generation of political leaders emerging, which are, they don't remember World War II, and they don't remember the horrors that the World War II caused, and they're therefore less likely to cooperate. But is there any other way that we can affect it? I mean, we are a minority issues research institute, and what we as minorities, or what minorities can do, as I told you in an intro, you did talk about these other levels of populations which could or should be engaged to make the United Nations more effective. So could these other levels of states also pressure their leaders to kind of be more cooperative on that international level, right? Could these sub-state spheres or sub-state levels of states, play a role in helping United Nations overcome this crisis? What is your assessment? And then after that, we will definitely open questions for all our guests today.
I mean, first, you're right. The picture I've painted is not a necessarily very rosy one when I hark back to the 1930s, but it's purposefully done. I mean, I've purposefully made that point because I think it's incredibly important not to delude ourselves into thinking that things are better than they actually are. I think we need to confront reality. And if the reality that I paint is an overly pessimistic one, so much the better. It means that what one has to do is it's less of a mountain that has to be climbed up. But and again, as you've mentioned, I guess I'm somewhat biased in my view of the world, having been a witness to so much suffering and violence. But then the second part is, so once we accept that things are not good, that institutions are not functioning, then I think we need to start with what do we have to work with? And I think we have the institutions, they exist. We have the rules, we have rules that were established. We have resolutions that were passed, so they exist. And then we have, I think, a new generation of activists, which is very interesting. What we've seen in Madagascar, in Morocco, in Nepal, what we currently see in Myanmar, they're basically the extension of the Arab Spring. There is a dynamic that exists in the world that is active. They don't necessarily lead. Well, I mean, very few have actually led to a significant transformation, but it doesn't mean that in a way, I think it's a Pandora's box. It doesn't mean that this activism has died. We see it reemerge. And so in a way, to address your second point, it's exactly that. If we accept the things as they are, unfortunately, if we see things as they, not accept, we can't accept. If we see things as they are now, then we have to start working with what we have, and we have to start targeting the different. Well, I mean, we have to start targeting the different points that actually can help to change, and unfortunately, and have the courage to understand, or have the courage not to delude ourselves into thinking that certain mechanisms that exist can actually work. I think we should start on the basis that things are really not good. We need to work with what we have. We need to build on what we have, and we need to sort of map out a path that will, for example, I think your point is very good. Work on politicians. Work on parliaments at the national level. We can what we have now that doesn't exist before is we can refer to legislations that exist. We can refer to resolutions that exist. So it gives it more credibility to a certain extent.
Okay, yeah, that's a good point, right? We have something to build upon. All right, so we have some questions, and I will invite people who pose them to ask them directly if they want. So, for example, Lilian or Lilia, do you want to ask your question?
Apologies, I'm not going to turn on my camera. Thank you very much for the lovely presentation, and it was very insightful. I just had a question in regard to, the ongoing UN liquidity crisis, right? Do you see as this crisis affecting mostly human rights programs at the UN, or does it also affect other functions that the UN has? So you mentioned, maritime, aviation, telecommunication, and things like that. So, but I was just wondering if it's affecting mostly the kind of human rights mandate that the UN has. Thank you.
Thank you. Where are you joining us from, Lilia?
Oh, apologies. I'm from the City Law School, City of St. George's. Thank you.
No, I mean, I think no, I think the liquidity crisis is a real threat to the UN, but I think it's on the service delivery side of the UN. So the humanitarian development and human rights. But I also see the liquidity crisis as providing, it should provide an opportunity to the UN to rethink its added value on the ground, because the UN has become a big institution on the ground, not necessarily the most cost-effective form of service delivery. I think the UN is a very interventionist form of service delivery, when what we see on the ground now are much stronger civil societies. We see local forms we see local forms of governance that exist, and much of the way the UN provides services is based on a 90s sort of approach, which is very much, and even the humanitarian principles. You come in, you provide service, you provide assistance, when what's needed today is much more to come in and support the empowerment of the local structures. I think one thing that we need to introduce into into the humanitarian approach, but even the developmental approach and others, is this notion of solidarity. That basically you come in to reinforce and support the local capacity to deal with the problem. And and um, and 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 how should what do I believe the UN should go back to? It should go back to becoming the guarantor of norms and standards. The UN agencies, the financial risk is enormous, but unfortunately it's not enormous enough to get individual UN agencies to completely rethink their approach. Right now, UN agencies, you see it, they're much more focused on doing as much as they can with less money, rather than thinking maybe we need to. First, I think this financial problem is a long-term one, so it's not a blip that can be overcome. But second, and because it's a long-term problem, it really is an opportunity. It should be an opportunity for individual UN agencies, or the UN agencies collectively, to completely rethink their approach and to focus their approach on local empowerment, even on the humanitarian side. The other side, and so that the way the UN is dealing with the financial crisis right now inevitably will mean that the first bit of the UN that will be hit the hardest is the human rights side and the protection side on the ground. So in that sense, you're right. I think the other organs that are more sort of the postal, and they are, they have their own they live in their own universe. But the dealing with suffering, dealing with vulnerable populations, that's where the UN has to fundamentally rethink its approach, and rethink it's an approach understanding that it is the communities on the ground that need to be the capacity on the communities on the ground. Their capacity needs to be built in order to address the horrors that they're confronting.
Very good. I read your also paper on rethinking delivering of aid and how things can be done more effectively. And I couldn't stop thinking how maybe states are afraid of what you're saying. that you're going to engage a different type of actors. But I also want to kind of speak in favor of your argument, because states are endangered by multinational corporations more so than any other non-state actors. And empowering local community, in fact, can very well serve on that level, can very well serve on supporting those fundamental rights that we have taught we have, like such as 8-hour workday and all other type of issues relating to labor and labor conditions, which are often forgotten as the human rights issues. And so, in fact, yeah, I don't see, like you, I'm more and more agree, I don't see any other way for global solidarity and cooperation and movement forward without too much of a conflict, unless we empower local and ground level communities and institutions and actors. I mean, if you want to comment on that, great. And then we can ask Mike for a question. Mike, so you're the next.
No, I mean, I think, I mean, I of course totally agree with you, agreeing with me. But I think
No, I was just meaning to mention that
no, I agree.
Misunderstand like what your arguments are.
No,
They
no,
sound
no.
like too extreme, but actually they're very much rooted in
No. But what I wanted to say is, I was at the time when I was making the argument, is it was very much in the context of fragmenting states. There was a study that was done by Chatham House and New York, the Center of International Cooperation, I think, New York University, where they found that more than 50% of populations, vulnerable populations today, were in contexts where basically the state was starting to fragment, and my point was, that what we're seeing in a lot of these areas where, and mostly it's an oppressive center, that the weakening of an oppressive center that allows the opportunity or creates this fragmentation. And my point was that fragmentation does not inevitably lead to what you witnessed and what you lived through in former Yugoslavia, which is sort of a balkanization, or that what we're seeing in a lot of these areas are local. I mean, we saw it in Syria when the Assad, at the first phase, when the Assad regime lost control of a lot of the country, we saw emerge these local councils, these local, the engineers, the doctors, the work came together to continue delivering services. I mean, we're seeing similar things now in Sudan with the emergency rooms. Definitely in Myanmar, where we're seeing the emergence of local governance structures. And what they're seeking is some form of autonomy in a state structure. So in a way, what I've been arguing with a number of governments is that we need to move on from our traditional Westphalian view of governance. That the country has to be governed from the center. And my point is, in the short to medium term, that doesn't work, because with fragmentation, you see emerge fairly homogeneous areas, because in mixed areas where there is violence and how individuals develop a basis by exacerbating differences. So you see people gravitating to areas where they feel safe. And the center is one of them. So when you come in, and I think that's one of the biggest Achilles heels of many of the UN peacekeeping missions, is when they come in, they have within their mandate the reestablishment of central authority. So they come into the capital, and their objective is to project the authority of the capital on the other areas. But in essence, what they're doing is they're projecting the authority of one group over others. So I think that the thinking we need to start developing is realizing that when you have these fragmented states, we should be looking at the different components and seeing how we can get the different components to come together around the center, rather than the other way around. Rather than building the state from the center out, build the state from the mosaic of increasingly autonomous areas into some form of functioning federal structure.
Okay, Mike, please.
All right. Thanks for the insights. It's actually so interesting that I have a zillion of questions and I don't know where to start. But I start from the beginning, probably. So United Nations, as you said, were born out of the aftermath of Second World War. And when the collective leadership understood that collaboration actually helps us better than focusing on individual nations and stuff. But then there was recently a kind of a development where this is seen more of a Western world order being superimposed on others. Now, this reputational, let's say, impact, does that lead to either participants just moving away because they say, "Well, I'm not interested at all in this," or what I would hope is there an emergence of a new world order? Are there other values where, like emerging nations say, "Look, it was all right what you did the last 20, 30 years, but now we are living in a new world order. These are new values. They are at least equal to what you said so far." So is it a disappointment and nations disappear, or is it a new order coming who are like passionate to make it work, maybe with different rules?
Mike, where are you joining us from?
I'm sorry, apologies. I'm joining from Munich. I'm not a researcher. I'm an interested citizen on many things. Apologies.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Go ahead, Charles.
I mean, I think I think there's a third way that we're seeing is China, and how China is now is in its own way embracing the UN. I'm not sure the extent to which they're embracing multilateralism, but they're definitely embracing the UN. So I mean, I think, you know, when it comes to the Western, I think it's you know, we did not fully appreciate in the 1990s how much what was being pushed through in the UN could be misunderstood by other parts of the world, you know. And so what one has to hope for is your second option, that you know, that the, you know, in a way this because, but I mean, in the 1990s, I think we didn't understand the extent to which what was being pushed through could be misunderstood. But then subsequently, I mean, the UN has been instrumentalized by the UN has been the most effectively instrumentalized by Western interests, by Western interventions. And so in that sense, you know, there is a throw the bathwater out, because the UN has become a tool of you know, in terms of its interventions, has become a tool of Western interventions, whether we look at, you know, what happened in Iraq, and then you know, Libya, as I mentioned. But what one has to hope for is that, you know, the expression that the baby's not thrown out with the bathwater, because the, you know, international cooperation, you know, one has to hope that there is this understanding that that countries, nations working together, you know, is you know, produces a much healthier and stabler world. So, but again, I think what's interesting is, you know, as much as the US now is receding from the UN, and you know, and the EU, or the Britain and France on the Security Council have much less legitimacy actually to be there. It's interesting to see how China now is coming, you know, and hopefully, you know, rather than seeing this as a confrontation and as a threat, hopefully it's what you've just said, that can that can be that can occur, is that we see this is a different approach, and sort of transform it into something much more constructive rather than threatening.
Okay, thanks.
Well, thank you, Mike. Interesting that you mentioned China is stepping up. China is essentially suggesting that instead of rule-based order, we now have law-based order. That will be quite an interesting transition if it goes to if it goes that way, right? I didn't expect that China will step in, but as the current actors are pulling back, obviously somebody will step in, and now it's only a matter of can the new actors hold it.
I mean, if sort of take a step back from reality, I think there are, I think one of the big problems we in the West didn't fully appreciate is how different we are across in our in our relationship between the individual and community. We in the West are very much focused on the rights of individuals, and that's what we need to push through and protect. While in other parts of the world, the community is essential. It's the community is the entity that functions, and the individual has to, is part of that community, and that's where the stability comes. And and in a way, that's something we've never really, that's not something that factored into these different instruments that were put in place in the 1990s, and it also comes into this whole notion of justice. How do after an event, what's the form of justice? We in the West very much focus on the culpability of individuals. This individual, while other parts are much more focused on how to get communities to come to terms with their past. How to get communities to come to terms with what happened. And in that regard, the individual does play a role, but the cathartic element is really the community able to deal with what they went through, rather than seeing, the condemnation of the individual as being the seminal piece for some form of justice. I mean, both exist, both have to exist, but.
Yeah. Very, very interesting. Yeah, I wrote about it in my book, but also Charles Petrie was discussing that how we have to find the balance between individual and group rights, and they're calling for liberalism 2.0 because the 2.1 liberalism with focus on individual rights, only can get us thus far. Svetlusha has a question. Go ahead, Svetlusha.
Thank you, Mirsad. Hello to everyone. My name is Svetlusha Surova, and I'm a director and senior researcher at MIRI. Thanks once again to Sir Petrie for being today with us and discussing this important topic while we celebrating Human Rights Day. So my question concerns with everything that was said this in the last moment, but also it is in similar vein what Mike was asking. So you were mentioning we focus here on the individual rights, then somewhere else the focus is on community. Jennifer Jackson Priest, when in her books about minority rights, she said we have all the time this tension between these individual rights, rights of the group or rights of the state. And when we are talking now about this United Nations, I wanted to ask, in many cases, the states, actually states are they are obliged to protect human rights. But in many cases, they are the ones who violate human rights, either of their own citizens or some other people on other territories. So, but on the other side, they are the members of the United Nations. So my question is, when Mike said he's concerned citizens, how should we empower citizens in this many times powerless situation with the state, and not only nationally. You were mentioning Generation Z, transnational activism, and different countries that the people are active, but how to empower them also on a global forum such as United Nations is how you see it. Is this maybe the way you said? You mentioned the concept of justice, but I'm more concerned about the concept of participation. How to involve other actors. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I would have to say I don't know because in terms of, I think what we're seeing now is populations that are being attacked and subjected to horrific violence. We're seeing international bodies take a stance and to say, this is not acceptable. More than this is not acceptable. This is totally unlawful and has to stop. And yet, it doesn't stop because the perpetrators and others are ignoring these things. Representation in the UN. I think there are a lot of bodies in the UN for minority rights and the rest where people come and talk and discuss the issues and resolutions and decisions are taken, but they don't really change the lives of the population below. But that sounds very depressing. But again, I think there is, especially those of us who are, a little bit, well, much older than this new Generation Z. I think they're the force. We are seeing the force, but not only when I was mentioning, and we just mentioned these local community, local governance structures. These are functioning entities that are trying to deal with the complexities and the situations their communities are confronting. So they're there, and then I think it beholds on us, the older ones who've lived through different things, to try and help them find ways of moving forward. So I think the energy is there. But not now. What's needed is to try and find a way to get that energy, as you said, to the right level, to have it in an effective way. Right now, I think it's definitely at the subnational level. That in a way, I don't know. I'm sure. Yeah, it's at the subnational level. It's building, coalition, moving up. Getting representation in local governments, then moving up to the level of the state, and trying to influence. But because, again, as I was saying, the UN establishes how the world could work and how it was defined after the Second World War. But it's not an enforcer, there's, without political will at that high level, you're not actually going to get change. So I think the change has to come from the ground, the new generation, and us working with the new generation to try and guide them, or not guide them, propose possibility, but very much right now. Right now I think it's working on parliaments. It's becoming much more politically active at the ground and moving up. I think that's the best way, because at the higher level, you don't necessarily see the same willingness.
It's as we teach in our classes, when we teach human rights, the main responsibility does lay with the local actors. Let's not forget that. So we are talking about United Nations as an important structure that's supposed to support human rights, but the real responsibility lies with local actors. And so as you are talking, it seems to me that the real struggle for near future for us all will be over who is going to control the states. The states will probably remain the main actors in these levels or attempts to cooperate, but who going to control the states? Is it multinational corporations? Is it some other foreign actors, or is it local people who will somehow find a way to regain the control of the states and then push for things that they care about? And I will assume that most people do want to see human rights upheld, because in the end, it benefits everybody, right? It benefits everybody. So we have another question by Mike, and I also have some questions which I'd like to use this opportunity, since you definitely have been part of United Nations for so long. You do know how things work behind the scene. So being that we want to educate public and empower public, maybe you can give us some hints of how these local actors can essentially, maybe interact with the United Nations more effectively, some practical advices. But let's first hear from Mike. Mike, please turn on your mic.
It helps if I unmute myself. Yes, still Mike, still from Munich, still interested citizen. You mentioned at the end of your speech that there could be a cataclysmic event like a war, bringing us all like to reason again. Maybe before that, because I'm also a future optimist, I think the United Nations has a bit the problem of that the EU has also. It's a body that we are all happy that we have it. It lacks a bit the powerful good stories, where you kindle the interest of the wide population and the individuals. Maybe you can share like 2 or 3 examples where you say, all right, this is where we see the power of UN. This is where it works. This is why we have it. And these are the stories that every one of us should share, so that we believe more in it. And it would be a sort of a grassroots thingy.
Very good. Very good.
Yeah.
Very good. Very good. Very good point. Yes.
See that as I mentioned it, I think at some point I have been a witness to multiple failures. I have had to, I was one of the last people to lead a UN mission into the Nuba Mountains when the Sudanese government at the time was attacking and enslaving, the Nubans. I was in Somalia. I was in Somalia during the whole Black Hawk Down, so I saw the failure of the West's intervention. I mean, it was, I came to Rwanda immediately afterwards, and it was clear to me that Rwanda was going to pay the price of Somalia, of the failure in Somalia. Yeah, I mean, it goes on 3 years with the Congolese rebels. I was in Afghanistan at the very beginning so very, very beginning, initially seconded to the Afghan government, and then Director of Policy and Planning for the UN. So there I saw an effort. I think the Afghans were very, were receptive to this international intervention. They thought that it would help resolve issues, would help get them a better life. But then I think what was interesting about Afghanistan is how we put justice. We ignored justice and focused on peace or stability, but by empowering the warlords. I saw a missed opportunity there. I then saw how a government used the impetus or the impetus behind Afghanistan to attach a political agenda, which was Iraq. So bounced off Afghanistan to deal with a completely different unassociated operation, but there was very much of a political objective in Iraq. Myanmar, of course, being there. So I mean, you know, so basically, I don't have a good story to tell you. But what I can tell you, is that the UN is a fairy tale. It's a fairy tale that we have all collectively accepted needs to exist. And what's essential is that we don't let this fairy tale die. You know, this notion that it is possible for the world community to work together. And right now, you know, the odds are very much against it. But I, you know, I guess the you know, and you know, the message. No, I do have something to tell you. I do have a story to tell you. So the story is that during the genocide in Rwanda, you know, it was possible if you weren't Belgian and you were basically a Western foreigner, you could drive around without any problem because the killers were convinced that what they were doing was correct. So they only started to hide it after a while. And what you would do is you would see, you know, so when you were driving around and you saw a car coming your way and there was a Westerner in the car, you would stop and you would get out and you would talk. And basically the first things you would talk about is how many barriers did you pass? You know, what were the barriers like? You know, were they being manned by kids? You know, were they being manned by the militia? Were they being manned by the military? Were people drunk? You know, what sort of reaction did you get to your way when you're answering their questions? And then you and then you do that, and then of course you start talking. You're just trying to get to know each other. And there was this Father Vieco, a Bosnian, actually Franciscan, and he had been in Rwanda for more than 10 years, and yet he was a remarkable individual. He was killed later, but I remember, and the killings in Rwanda, they weren't sort of linear. They were through phases. So you had the first initial killings, then you had a period where you had less killings, but people were hiding, and then you had a second round of killings when people who had been hiding could no longer survive in their hideouts, and so they would come out and they would go to the barrier. And those who had money would ask to be shot to death rather than hacked to death. And I remember meeting Father Vieco at the time of that second round of killings, because of course they were, you know. And I asked Father Vieco, how do you keep going? You know, how do you keep going? How do you continue to have this optimism, this belief that you know that you know things can get better, I guess. And he said, you know, if you believe in something and you believe in something, you believe that something needs to be done and it's essential that it be done, so you believe it from the you know, from the most profound, from within the deepest part of yourself, that it's a truth that needs to be realized, never stop. He said, because you never know. You may be the person in the middle of the desert, in the middle of the night, that holds a torch that will allow somebody else to accomplish what you believe needs to be accomplished. So for me, you know, I unfortunately, you know, I'm not able to function with good stories, but I mean, I've been following Father Vieco's words ever since. You know, but again, you know, I think the UN came out of horrendous suffering. It worked for a while, you know, for quite a while. You know, there were some flaws in the way it worked, but it's a fairy tale that it is essential that is not lost or that does not disappear, and it won't, because I think it's been ingrained in international relations through the different bodies that exist.
If I may, I will tell that's how I say to my students, it's not a fairy tale, it's a love. love is same thing, right? It exists only if we believe it exists. If we don't believe it exists, then it doesn't. So let's call it a love rather than a fairy tale, because fairy tale has a negative implications. But
No, you're right. I totally accept what you're saying.
Love is better. Why? Because as we say, it only exists for as much as we believe in it. Yeah, it's quite fascinating. I saw in your conversations, and that's what inspired me when you spoke about some of these local actors, particularly in Rwanda. Similar stories were in Bosnia too, like in other places, in Croatia, in Serbia, where the local actors stepped up and said, I believe in this, and I'm going to do whatever I can to save somebody, protect somebody. So these are quite inspirational stories, right? And any other stories like that from Rwanda that you recall where local communities organized and essentially step up and did provide people with those basic human rights that people are supposed to have?
Well, I mean, there's, I think, well, I think one of the bits of Rwanda that's really interesting is that, of the only religious community that functioned, that did not get involved in the killings, that was not caught up, was the Muslim community. That is the only community that collectively refused to get caught up in the violence. But no, I mean, not only, I mean, Myanmar 2 years ago, because I've been really pushing this local governance, having worked on the humanitarian and then the political side, having spent almost 7 years in different iterations in Myanmar, in the conflict in Myanmar, I realized that traditional humanitarian aid was not getting through, and that and that we needed to have a different approach. And that's where it became really clear to me that we needed to work with these local governance structures, because local structures were emerging. So 2 years ago, I crossed from Thailand into Myanmar with one of the rebel groups. So I crossed illegally, and I spent 6 weeks in some of these areas. And I went to see one, to get a sense of how the conflict was being fought, how the fighting was being fought, and how much terrain these groups were actually controlling, and how the government was trying to attack them. But then I really wanted to get a sense of the local governance structures. How were the populations, how were their needs being administered, and it was really, really interesting. Very, very strong local governance, very much civil society involvement. But the one thing I hadn't expected at all to see was the Generation Z. And what you have in Myanmar today is a generation of activists who completely think outside the box in terms of their parents. They have their own music, they have their own reference points. They're in touch. They were in touch with the milk tea movement. They're in touch with other movements outside. They even have their own language, and the internet, allows them, and social media allows them to interact. And Myanmar has had the longest standing insurgency on the planet, continuous fighting in the different areas. And these young activists were telling me, because I was talking about civil war, and they said, you don't understand. This is no longer a civil war. This is a revolution. And they said, we don't want a negotiated peace. We want a fundamental transformation of what we're living through. So they said, this is a revolution, and the revolution wants a different state. And they said, we want a federal state where our not needs, but where we feel we're represented at the center, rather than the center but saying that they can represent us. And to a certain extent, they were willing to accommodate. They were smart enough or politically astute enough to understand that they were not going to defeat the military. that they were not going to march into Naypyidaw, that there needed to be a process where the state, where the construction of the state could accommodate could accommodate them and the areas that they were in. So and I think, look at, I mean, fascinating, the movement now in Madagascar, or even in Morocco, Morocco, the young wake up, they come up and they say, hey, look, we have no hospitals. Why are you guys making stadiums, football stadiums? Listen to us, how in Nepal, and how they're using social media, how they're using ChatGPT. For example, in Nepal, when the young or these activists were trying to identify who would be the best prime minister to support, one of the tools they used was ChatGPT, or how in Morocco the way this network was developed was through the chat component of a gaming platform, so that the intelligence services couldn't follow what was happening. So for me, these are all stories of an incredibly dynamic movement that we, the older generation, we need to help them find ways of going up and expressing themselves and having impact. We need to find ways of helping them have impact.
Yeah, well, I hope they didn't tell you 6'7", like this is now a craze in the United States, like a generation says 6'7", and that's supposed to mean something. Yes, a lot of these actors are basically fighting in a way not to be defeated, not necessarily to win, but to be there and assert their agenda. I read about this story about Muslim community in Rwanda protecting people, and if you have seen that, I would be quite. I mean, I always wonder, how did that work on the ground, right? How did they do that? But before that, we have a Birch wants to ask a question, so then maybe we can go into that if you want, and then soon after that, we have to finish.
Hello, good afternoon to you all. My name is Burç Ceylan. Apologies first and foremost for two things. One, I was unfortunately late. Something happened which I could not plan my time well enough. So I missed at least the first 10 minutes of the presentation. I apologize. I apologize for that. But the rest of the conversation was pretty much based on UN's competencies and a change of time that comes with it. My second apologies is that I cannot turn on my camera because my background is not really so proper. But I wanted to not ask a question, but a comment in respect of dear Professor Mirsad Kriještorac, whom I know very well and I respect a lot. So I just wanted to a little contribute, if I may, with my background. I'm a former diplomat with former UN officer as well. Not as experienced as Honorable Speaker Sir Charles Petrie, if I'm pronouncing the name correct, but I carry some 25 years of diplomatic career. My analysis with regard to what's going on with the UN is first based on the foundation that how we understand or how we see what the UN is. To me, and probably it was the same during the presentation, UN is regarded as if it is it has an independent will and it's a supranational body, but actually it isn't. It is just the sum of national will, the national will of member states. The decisions are taken at national level, then combined. The strategy in this case should be to influence member states, and this exactly converges with our speaker. The strategy should be to influence member states at national level, and so that they can carry this responsibility to the United Nations on their own will. This is easier done in democracies. As a matter of fact, financial contribution of the UN is predominantly made by the democratic nations. So this is good news. But influencing member states is easier with social media networks compared to, let's say, 50 years ago. So looking into the future, I think there is room for optimism. Yet the flip side of the coin, If we come to a general conclusion that the world is getting more and more authoritarian, I don't know if there's such a comment during this presentation, but at least this is what I believe. Then I'm sorry we're losing, and we're losing in more than one front. We should take the fight to a different front. The answer to the question from one of the participants, how I summarize is, what is UN good for? I think UN is a tool when no single member state can deliver alone or is not allowed to deliver alone. And you need to collaborate as you share the responsibility, be it financial or legally. This UN as an independent body can initiate good projects, though, like, for example, peaceful use of space, like action against landmines, like many other projects handled by UNICEF for children, like for UN Women, UNHCR for refugees, and UNDP for development purposes, for example, as long as these are supported by major member states. And I'm referring back to those financial contributors. These projects do touch human lives, and maybe not you, maybe not me, maybe none of us among the participants, but millions across the world over decades have benefited from it, and that's what UN is good for. This is my small contribution, if I may. I hope it was beneficial, and thank you for the organization and everyone who contributed to it. I enjoyed the portion that I listened to. Thank you so much, Mirsad.
Thank you, Rich. Thank you for your joining us, and we appreciate your contribution. Mr. Petrie, you want to add to anything before?
I agree. I just think that I think, and I totally agree that there are millions of people who are benefiting or have benefited from the UN and the UN services, but the problem is, there will be far less money available. And also, I think there's there's much more awareness and much more capacity at the local levels, local communities, and we should be sort of switching our approach to one of rather than interventionist to one of solidarity. But I want to answer you, to give you your right. I think what the Muslim population in Rwanda did that others refuse to do is they refuse to give to differentiate their communities, and they refuse to hand over the Tutsis to the killers. So they remained totally. There was an extraordinary level of solidarity as a community, and it was the only community, defined community that did it. You have fantastic stories of individuals, smaller communities, priests, but equally you have some horrific stories of, many of the killings that occurred in Rwanda were in churches, because the people were incited. You had priests who incited people to find protection in the churches, and then the Interahamwe would these are stories that you guys know as well as I do. And then the Interahamwe would encircle the churches, and they would do things to the people who were still alive, and it would take them 4 days. Now, the one thing I think, and it comes to the whole horror genocide, for me, one of the issues, or one of the dimensions of the Rwanda genocide that I've really grappled with, was the role of the Catholic Church, and how much a number of priests were involved in the killings but then how afterwards the Catholic Church didn't seem to understand the need to hold these individuals somehow, if not to account vis-a-vis the state, because they protected, but how you had a number of priests, especially in France, who continued to give the sacrament. I remember I met a cardinal once after Rwanda, and I said, Monsignor, I can totally understand. Well, not understand. Yeah, I can understand, maybe not accept, but I can understand that you do not want to hand over one of your own to the civil justice, to the state for justice. But what I can't understand is why you allow an individual against whom there are very, very serious allegations to continue giving the sacrament. I said, wouldn't it be better to send the individual to a monastery and to have the individual, face God, if in terms of that belief, come to terms with what he and she, because there are also some nuns involved, he and she did in total isolation. So no, I think the Muslim community in Rwanda was exemplary in terms of the standards they set.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's reminiscent again of 1930s. During the World War II, Albanian Muslims were also known for saving Jews, and that was the only country in Europe that had more Jewish population after World War II than before, because they provided sanctuary for people. But we have Dr. Paul now also wanting to ask a question. Dr. Paul, and obviously I didn't elaborate on Mr. Birch. Kind of, that's essentially what we were talking about, how democratization, ultimately, that's what Mr. Petrie is talking about, how democratization on the local level is essentially contributing now to upholding the rights and norms that the United Nations established, but states are now reluctant to uphold. So balance again. Dr. Paul, go ahead.
Yes, hello, and good afternoon. I'm Stefan Paul Jost. Let me try and also put my camera on if I can manage to do so. Can you hear me all right? It seems
we hear you very well.
Very good. Very good.
Joining us from.
Very good. Please call me just Stefan. I'm a former WHO representative to Myanmar, and in fact, I served together with Charles Petrie even on an earlier assignment. I was twice assigned to that very special country that both Charles and I know very well, and precisely because. I think, can you see me now? Is it working?
Now we see you, yes.
Very good, very good. And precisely because we know it well, we feel, I think, a kinship in heartache, truly, for the peoples of Myanmar who are suffering beyond belief, and very few people are even noticing. But beyond that, I would also like to thank you very much, Charles and Mr. Chairman, for the remarks on the Muslim community in Rwanda, which I had not fully known and appreciated before. And it is really very encouraging to hear, because that does remind me of the Old Testament, really, and the sanctity of human life, that the Muslim faith, the Christian faith, and the Jewish faith all are supposed to have in common. And it's very good to see that adhered to. On the role of the Catholic Church, well, of course, I mean, I'm reminded there of the odious role of the Catholic Church in Nazi Germany, and sorry to have to even bring that up, but it was similarly unacceptable, I would say, to what Charles has just mentioned to have occurred. My question really is on the situation in Myanmar that is still very much also, if you like, bothering me for the relative lack of humanitarian attention, and for the fact that the United Nations system, as Charles has rightly mentioned, seems not really capable of delivering the humanitarian promise that it has entered into. There are exceptions to that. It's not black and white, but on the whole, my experience is similar to Charles in that he's right. that the UN system, including WHO, very sadly, and health should not be politically bound one way or another, but is tied up, even the WHO is tied up with this belief that the powers that be are the ones that call the shots. And that is very sad and disappointing to see. And even after I've retired from WHO, I've found myself trying largely in vain to bring about a few novel approaches to humanitarian assistance to be delivered to Myanmar. And it was not totally in vain. Of course, nothing ever is, I believe, but it's very encouraging to hear you, Charles, about your experience in Myanmar with Generation Z and the thinking out of the box and the actions that they're taken. At the same time, the question, of course, then arises in my mind, how can we best or better support the local structures that are emerging, the local governing structures that are emerging? For two reasons. One, for the humanitarian needs in their own right. That alone should be sufficient. But also, as Charles was alluding to learn how we can deliver in a novel way humanitarian assistance that we've all promised to deliver, and that should be delivered to people in need, regardless of affiliation. And that is not really happening as promised, and we must not fail in that promise. Despite the onslaught of the current American administration that is anti-humanitarian and federalism says, of course, have been key to the foundation of the United Nations system itself. And despite the fact that obviously they're key to, or were key to, nearly all the UN agencies that came to exist, including, of course, the WHO. So therefore, despite this very chilly international environment, we must not put the flame out. We must keep the faith and protect humanitarian space for health and beyond health, and also see to it that we tune in to support the local emerging structures that are there and that desperately need support as far as Myanmar is concerned. And there will be other countries that also desperately require support. So therefore, my question again to Charles, perhaps, how can we better support those local structures that are emerging, given the international environment that we find ourselves in at the present time? Thanks a lot. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Paul. Thank you very much. Let's finish with this. That will be the last question for today. Mr. Petrie, go ahead.
I mean, I think it's I think the best way to the way to support it's very much on a case by case, looking at different contexts, different as Stefan, as you know, in Myanmar, you've got this fragmentation of governance structures. Some are more positive than others. I mean, you do have warlords and criminal networks. So I think it's a question of really doing your homework and trying to understand what these different structures are, how they're functioning, what they need, and above all, allowing them to retain the initiative. I think the UN in Myanmar, the new head, sort of, is actually a very, very good person. So I'm a little bit more hopeful in terms of her ability to lead the organization. But ultimately, the UN is a small player. I mean, it's much more developing, trying also to get these getting these local structures to look at. I mean, but that's pretentious. We don't. I mean, a lot of these local structures are looking at other forms of revenue generation and other forms of support. But it's very much on a case by case basis. But not giving up. Yeah.
Excellent. It's encouraging to see interest and encouraging to see our participants all expressing hope. We do hope as well. We love to, to continue to love, as we said before. And we promise to maybe repeat the conversation with Mr. Petrie. There is quite an interesting things that you can tell us based on the experiences in the places where you were. We appreciate your willingness to talk to us today. And in that way, we both commemorate the World Human Rights Day, which we focused on minorities very much care about, and also to talk about current status of United Nations, not in the sense of being pessimist or anything else, but in the sense of basically pleading to everybody to continue to love and continue to support United Nations. With that said, we invite you to sign in for our newsletters so you can join us for the future conversations like this. This will soon show on our website as a recording, and you're welcome to view it. Thank you very much for joining us, and see you all in January.
Thank you.